So today's sermon is the story of The King and I, not the musical starring Deborah Kerr and Yul Brynner, though a church production thereof is not outside the realm of possibility given the range of talents in this congregation. No, this is the story of an activist formation and journey and the influence that the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s life, message, and actions have played in it. This is a personal story. Mine. Though I've been planning this sermon for weeks, as it came together, I wrestled with the appropriateness of choosing to talk about my own story on a holiday honoring one of the most influential peace activists in history. But then I remembered that what hooked me into Dr. King was not his speeches or the factual trappings of his history, but his stories. The anecdote I shared with the children today I first heard when I was their age, and it helped me understand the civil rights movement in a way no history lesson could have. Plus, there is more to say about Dr. King than can or should be said in one sermon, one weekend out of the year. So next time, I will be preaching on race in the U.S. today, using his work as a lens. And there will almost certainly be a third sermon before my year is done here. But today, I can think of no better way to honor Dr. King's story than to tell my own. In fact, if I am to minister to the social justice concerns of my congregation and community, it is the logical place from which I must begin. As I tell you this story, I want you to bear a few things in mind. First, understand that this story, although this story is deeply personal, it isn't just about me. It has pieces of other stories. Perhaps you will hear pieces of your own. For I know you all have stories too. I encourage you to listen for those places of identification, of connectivity. This is my second suggestion. Please listen for the similarities. You will hear things that seem completely foreign to you on the surface. I invite you to go deeper, to connect with the feelings woven into my experience that speak to something in yours. Find that and connect with it, for this is the basis of empathy, one core element of any successful movement toward change. Third, I do not want you to dismiss or minimize the differences. As I talked about in this morning's forum, minimization ignores the reality of people's lived experiences. Difference exists and difference is good. When you feel fear about a difference, lean into it. Be curious. Ask yourself where discomfort comes from and be honest. Ask me later, respectfully, about what you do not understand in those differences. Be honest there, too. This builds trust, the companion piece to empathy, both within yourself and between you and others. And trust is vital to the work of creating a better world. Finally, I want to acknowledge that this story is deeply personal, and that telling it to you is an act of trust on my part, of vulnerability, of intimacy. I am telling you things that have risked my life at one point or another, and that still could. And I am trusting you to be good, loving stewards of that information. This is the tender work of community building. This is how we learn to be and work together, both inside and outside these walls. One of my earliest acts of activism was marching in the Martin Luther King Day Parade as a ninth grader with All Souls. I had done service projects before. I worked on Habitat for Humanity houses and collected canned goods, raised money for charities. But the act of marching in honor of a man whose life and legacy of radical love were underscored by the cold brutality of his death was one of the first times I had, in some small way, walked with the struggle for justice rather than simply safely doing things for it. Plus, as a middle-class white kid, walking in impoverished, almost exclusively black North Tulsa was a few steps out of my comfort zone. As we marched down Greenwood Avenue, still hauntingly quiet, 3/4 of a century after the race riots burned it to the ground, I felt every hair on my body stand up as we sang, "We Shall Overcome." This was the first time I did something a little dangerous, and it would not be the last. Fast forward a couple of years to the World AIDS Day walk. As a junior at Booker T. Washington High School in Tulsa, I was the leader in a student organization about sexual health issues and a member of a student-led movement to start the first official gay-straight alliance in Oklahoma public schools. Again, we marched on the north side of Tulsa, this time in the dark, this time smaller in number, this time louder, this time angrier. We were mourning the dead. We were crying for just treatment of the living. We were singing again, "We Shall Overcome." And as we did, I felt in my bones a connection to Dr. King and the students who marched in Selma and Birmingham, gentle, angry people who would meet fear and hate and violence with peaceful but forceful resistance. Fast forward 6 months to the 2000 Tulsa Pride Parade, the second one in the city to be sanctioned by a permit and protected by police. It was nothing like the 2013 Pride that shocked me my first year back in Tulsa, with thousands of people from all over the country, and live music and food trucks and merriment. In 2000, we were a small band of activists taken to the streets in a revolutionary act that said, "We will not be erased. We are not ashamed. We're here. We're queer. Get used to it." From my perch on a flatbed truck, I could see the whites of the Phelps family's eyes as they waved a sea of black, hateful signs in the Westboro Baptist Church's spot in front of the Wendy's on Brookside. I was standing next to my friend Natalie's mother. We were on the back of the Now float, holding round purple signs that said, "Lesbian rights." Back then, I was a 5'5" punk kid, short, spiky, bleach-tipped hair, ball chain necklaces, baggy clothes, my signature black Converse, a couple rings in each ear, and underneath all that, a body that had felt less and less like my own since I had entered puberty a few years earlier. I did not have words for this then, only a growing sense of discomfort and disconnection from my physical form. I knew that I was different, had always been different, had come up with 1,000,001 reasons and explanations for why I was different, and still felt like an utter enigma to myself. I was not like the other girls. I wanted to be accepted by the boys, but had no framework in which to put that desire other than attraction, which wasn't quite right. I'd frequently been taken for a little boy since I was a toddler, since I was 8 years old with hair down my hips. I had never minded. In fact, I'd rather liked it. My daydreams and fantasies were boy-like imaginings of knights in shining armor saving princesses and slaying dragons. My favorite book characters were little boys with whom I identified. I chased frogs and climbed trees and dressed up as male historical figures. I had even done an acted-out book report on Abe Lincoln while wearing a fake beard when I was 11. That was the same year my body had begun to betray me, when it forced me to acknowledge that, like it or not, it was, and had always been, female. That was a part I had never known how to play, no matter how hard I tried to learn. Back then, transgender was not a well-known concept. My only associations with it were people on Jerry Springer, who were shown as confused men in dresses, freak shows to be pitied at best, ridiculed at worst, dehumanized regardless. I was definitely not one of them. I had never heard the terms FTM or transgender man. Did not know the difference between a transvestite, someone who likes to dress in the clothes of another gender, transgender, someone who identifies with a gender other than the one they were given at birth, and transsexual, someone who is transgender and takes medical action to change their body to match their gender identity. At 16, I did not know that in a few short years I would come to embody each of these labels. All I knew was that I was different. I liked girls more than boys, and I hated wearing dresses and makeup. When I'd come out as bisexual the year before, after a miserable freshman year of trying to look and act like the girl I wasn't, I felt such relief at first that I figured I must have solved the mystery of my difference. But though my orientation was a big piece of the puzzle, it was not the whole picture. As I got more comfortable with myself, my appearance changed fairly rapidly. My hair got shorter and shorter, my clothes looser and looser, my walk returned to the bow-legged swagger I'd always had before my best friend had tried to teach me to walk like a woman. And as that emergence of true self happened, I started experiencing the same things I had throughout childhood. Uncomfortable distancing from girls, mocking jeers from boys. Only now it was worse. Now it was menacing. Now there was a fuel of fear and anger to back it up. In the halls I heard dyke, queer, faggot swirling around me in hushed tones and occasionally hurled at the back of my head as I passed, just like a bauble would be a few years later as I walked down an unfamiliar street, a near miss. I was followed in the halls by boys who asked pointed, rhetorical questions, just like those men on the street later would. You think you're a man? I'll show you a man. Let me at your girlfriend. I'll show her a real man. You sit, stupid dykes. And when they inevitably got to me and I wanted to go yell in their faces and tell them that real men don't get girls by harassing other people's girlfriends, my girlfriend would pull me back and talk me down. You have to be better than them, she'd say. Just like Martin's mother may have told him when the white kids were mean to him. And in those moments, I began to draw strength from Martin, who drew strength from Jesus' teachings about loving your enemies. In a sermon thusly titled, he said, "When the opportunity presents itself for you to defeat your enemy, that is the time in which you must not do it." That is the meaning of love. Love is creative, understanding goodwill for all men. It is the refusal to defeat any individual. When you rise to the level of love, of its great beauty and power, you seek only to defeat evil systems. Individuals who happen to be caught up in that system you love, but you seek to defeat the system. So I channeled my anger into activism and art. I didn't always succeed in loving my enemies. Far from it. I learned nonviolence by failing at it. I still do. I would lose my temper. I would pick battles impulsively, and sometimes they were the wrong ones. But I also picked the right ones. And I always strove to fight with truth, not hate, with reason, not threats, with love, not fear. For as Martin also said, darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. And I believe that I drove out some darkness and hatred with my insistence upon being seen as a human being. Still, I knew not everyone would agree to do so. These were the days of Brandon Tina and Matthew Shepard. I had friends who were threatened, stalked, and beaten. I was followed multiple times myself. Had a brick thrown at my car while I was driving it. Also a near miss. I feared for my life every time I walked out my front door. I put on my emotional armor, turned my vigilance up to full tilt. These things still happen to me when I talk about the memories, or when I see certain images or hear certain noises, or when a person with a certain kind of energy comes into my field of vision. My palms sweat, my breath quickens, my heart races, my senses go on red alert. Sometimes it wakes me up in the middle of the night, even now. This is called post-traumatic stress syndrome. It's a scar as permanent as the ones on my chest, where breast tissue used to be, but we're not there yet. When I was 17, I stumbled upon a book of essays called Lesbian Words, from which I learned what all those terms meant: transvestite, transgender, transsexual. I learned about female masculinity and drag kings. I learned that gender was more than male and female, that there was a spectrum full of nuance and beautiful complexity between and around that biological binary, that biology itself wasn't even a binary. I learned that I didn't have to be a woman. My awakening was beginning. In my next act of activism, I shared it with my congregation at All Souls. My senior sermon at Youth Sunday 2001 was about my journey to that point of not fitting into the F box. When I was 18, I ran away to New Orleans. I could not take the pressure anymore. Staying in Tulsa, looking the way I did, which is to say, in between, felt like a death sentence. Better to take my chances in a strange city known for its love of strange people, with only my dysfunctional relationship to keep me afloat. Maybe Fred Phelps didn't travel that far? When I was nearly 19, I bound my chest, drew on facial hair, put on men's clothing, and lip-synced on stage for the first time. I got compliments that made my heart swell in a way nothing ever had before. My girlfriend made me promise that I wouldn't transition. I had not yet even considered that it was possible for me to do so, so I promised. For then, I was a transvestite, as well as a drag king. I would dress, at least occasionally, even when not on stage. When I left that relationship a year later, I had read Leslie Feinberg's Transgender Warriors, gotten a trans tattoo, and begun to identify as trans something. No suffix yet. I knew I needed chest surgery. The rest I was figuring out, but I was definitely transgender. When I was 21, I figured it out. I had been trying desperately to live in the body I had for as long as I could muster, and I couldn't pretend for a second longer that it was working. I was depressed. I was drinking heavily to cope. I was anxious all the time. The feel of extra flesh on my chest turned my stomach every time I moved. My alto voice sounded foreign every time I opened my mouth. I needed surgery and hormone replacement as soon as possible. I was transsexual. When I was 22, after just a few months on testosterone, I found myself residing in Dallas after Hurricane Katrina washed away my life as I knew it. I was back in the area of the country I had fled 4 years earlier, and I was terrified. New PTSD combined with old to create such a melee of confusion that I felt my only choice, safety and sanity-wise, was to go stealth. Meaning, in the trans vernacular, that I would keep my medical history a secret and live as a man who had been born that way. As an activist, I hated the decision. But it seemed that I had no other choice. I felt like Martin must have, as a college student, when he tried to fit in at a mostly white northern school. When I was 24, pressure had gotten to me. Though my stealthiness had bought me privacy to let the hormones take effect and have chest surgery, it had brought with it an untenable amount of fear of what might happen if I were discovered. To quote Martin again, as my sufferings mounted, I soon realized that there were two ways in which I could respond to my situation. Either to react with bitterness, or to seek to transform the suffering into a creative force. I decided to follow the latter course. And I learned what another trans activist would later tell me, that if you keep it a secret, people can use it against you. But if you own your history, you deprive them of that power and you keep it for yourself. So I made a deal with myself. I would use the power of my newfound male privilege to have conversations and change hearts and minds that could not have heard me as a gender-ambiguous female. Where it was helpful and safe, I would share my own story. This has been my mode of operation ever since. Though up until recently I have erred on the side of caution, perhaps to a fault. This began to change 2 months into my first semester of seminary, when I attended the UU Mosaic Makers Conference, a multicultural ministries symposium at All Souls. Liberation theologian Miguel de la Torre was the keynote speaker, and he posed to us the cutting question: what are you willing to sacrifice and crucify in yourself to be part of this movement? Meaning, what point of personal pride, ego, or self must we sacrifice in the name of solidarity, that we may effectively carry out the work of justice? My answer seemed to flood through and out of my core and stare me right in the face so I couldn't ignore it. For me, it was my fear of death. Ever since I went stealth in Dallas, my fear of death, instilled in me as a young activist for LGBTQ rights, had kept me from speaking the fullness of my truth, and thus from using it to advance those causes that would lessen the potential of death for me and for others. Of course, I had to recognize the risk. Dr. King is a prime example of how prophetic voices are all too often silenced. But what good was my story if I could not tell it freely? Fearing retribution for my difference based on a lifetime of experiencing just that, I had knowingly used my privilege to become invisible, to try to change the system from the inside instead of prophetically challenging it from the outside. The last thing I wanted to do, the last thing I want to do now, is lead with a piece of my identity. But there is a price to keeping it quiet, and that is my integrity. Thus I began to search for a middle ground. And ever since, I have been learning to walk that border, a liminal space that includes both risk and security, both stealthiness and visibility. This is the story I wanted to tell you. The story of learning to use my story, like Martin did. This is where I connect personally with justice work, the lived experience that fuels me to fight for equality on all fronts: racial, religious, class, etc., etc., etc. Now, as minister, 10 years into my transition, I face a new challenge. How and when is it appropriate to share my story? And what is the difference between discretion and secrecy? I have known that I could not keep this from you ever since I agreed to serve this church last fall. Some of my greatest gifts draw from the experiences I've shared in this story. But I've also known that to tell it at the wrong time would be to use it unwisely. So I have waited, not so much in fear, but in discernment. For I know from experience that without that relational foundation of empathy and trust, when people learn that I am trans, they can have trouble hearing anything else I say afterwards without filtering it through that first. The story has power. It has to be handled with reverence and care. Today, I feel more fully than ever a quote that I memorized from that book of essays that changed my world at age 17, and so I will leave you with it. It is by Robin Podolsky, writing about her experience in activism during the AIDS epidemic in the 80s and 90s. And I have to tell this story because my sisters are burning. My brothers are turning to ash. Those who fought most bravely, those harlots turning in the flame. And I have to tell this story so that there will be descendants, so that there will be honoring, and a thread to trace backwards, so we will not be lost again. I implore you to find your thread and trace it back. You will find the story that moves you to act. Thank you for your attention. Blessed be. Before we leave this place, and while you are standing, I would invite you to open your hymnals to number 170, We Are a Gentle, Angry People.